So in the last lesson, we talked about blood vessels, and we started going over some of the blood vessels that are attached to the heart, things like the vena cava and the aorta. We are now going to learn about all of the different structures of the heart and how they function today. So for this lesson on the heart, we're going to be going over all of the different structures of the heart, how the blood moves through the pulmonary and systemic circuits, and how they connect to one another. We're going to talk about all of the different like valves in the heart. We're going to talk about the role of coronary arteries and what to do about coronary blockages. We're going to talk about how heart rate is controlled. We're going to kind of briefly touch on the autonomic nervous system's job in regulating heart rate and the difference between systole and diastole. So the heart is a muscular organ that pumps blood throughout the body. The pericardium is a fluid-filled membrane that surrounds the heart. It prevents any friction, fluid prevents any friction between that pericardium and the heart. Then, like as the heart is beating and moving, there's going to be fluid between the pericardium and the heart. The right and left side of the heart are separated by a septum. The human heart has 4 chambers. There are 2 atria at the top, so a right atrium and a left atrium, and then 2 ventricles at the bottom, again a left ventricle and a right ventricle. The atria are fairly thin walled and they receive blood from the veins, so blood is coming to the heart and then in through the atria. And then the ventricles have thick muscular walls because they are pumping the blood out of the heart into the arteries that then move the blood away from the heart. So this is kind of what the structure of the heart looks like. So again, we have the right atrium and the right ventricle underneath it. On the other side, the left atrium and left ventricle. You will notice when you're looking at this that the right ventricle is like on your left side, but that's because it's labeled as if it was like inside of you. So if you like turn around and face the same direction as the picture, the lefts and rights match up with your lefts and rights. So blood is going to come into the heart from the body through the vena cavas, so either the superior vena cava from the top of the body or the inferior vena cava from the bottom of the body. It's then going to go into the right atrium. The right atrium pumps it down into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, bigger pump to push it out of the heart. It's going to go out through the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary means lung, so the pulmonary artery is going away from the heart towards the lung. The pulmonary veins are then coming back towards the heart from the lungs. So the blood is going to come in through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, little squeeze down to the left ventricle, and then big squeeze out the aorta to the rest of the body. So the pulmonary circuit includes the part of that pathway that is moving blood between the heart and the lungs. So deoxygenated blood is going to come in through into the right atrium from the vena cava. That's going to little pump down to the right ventricle and then bigger pump out to the pulmonary arteries to the 2 different lungs. The blood is then going to go through those pulmonary arteries, through some arterioles and into the capillary beds in each lung. At the capillaries, that is where gas exchange happens. So the carbon dioxide that is in the blood moves out into the lungs and the oxygen from the lungs moves into the blood. So at that point, the blood becomes oxygenated. It is then going to be carried back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. The systemic circuit includes the pathway of blood that's from the heart to the body. So the oxygenated blood comes from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The left atrium gives a little squeeze. The blood goes into the left ventricle. That gives a big pump, which pushes the oxygenated blood out of the aorta. The aorta branches out into smaller arteries and then smaller arterioles and finally capillary beds all over the body. And at those capillaries, the oxygen that was in the blood is going to diffuse out into the tissues and the cells that are around it. Now the blood is deoxygenated. It's also going to pick up some carbon dioxide from the tissues, and then that deoxygenated blood is going to move from the capillaries to venules, to veins, all the way to the two vena cava, where the blood goes back into the right atrium. So the two different systems are obviously completely interconnected to one another. Again, the deoxygenated blood is going to come in from the body to the right side of the heart, then pumped out of the right side of the heart to the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated, comes back into the left side of the heart, then pumped out of the left side of the heart to the body, and then at the body capillaries, it becomes deoxygenated again, and that system starts over. There are a bunch of different valves which separate different sections of the heart. A pair of those valves are called Atrioventricular Valves, or just AV valves for short. And these AV valves separate the atria from the ventricles. That's where the name AV comes from. It's between the atrium and the ventricles. The right AV valve is also called the tricuspid valve. The left AV valve is also called the bicuspid valve. These are one-way valves, just like what you would find, say, in your veins. And essentially, they make sure that blood doesn't backflow. So when blood is pumped out of the atrium, it goes through these valves down to the ventricle. Then when the ventricle pumps, these valves make sure that blood does not backflow up into the atrium. Instead, the blood has to go out of the arteries. So that's they're one-way valves. They allow blood to flow from atrium to ventricle, but not from ventricle back to atrium. We also have other valves called semilunar valves, which separate the arteries from the ventricles. So essentially it separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary arteries and the left ventricle from the aorta. Essentially, when the ventricles pump, these valves open up to allow blood from the ventricles into the arteries. And then when the ventricles relax again, the valves close and blood cannot slide from the arteries back into the ventricles. Again, just another diagram of what this all looks like. So this is the right atrium. Again, blood would come from the body, deoxygenated, through either the superior or inferior vena cava into this right atrium. The right atrium would squeeze, the blood would go through this tricuspid valve right here into the right ventricle. The right ventricle would squeeze, blood would go out of this semilunar valve into the pulmonary artery, which then splits to go to the two different lungs. The blood goes to the lungs and is oxygenated. It comes back through the pulmonary veins, which are here and here. Both of those pairs of pulmonary veins come into the left atrium. That's going to squeeze. Blood is going to go through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle squeezes. Blood is going to go out through these semilunar valves into the aorta, which is this big tube here that then goes around behind the heart and comes out at the bottom right here. This is also aorta. Okay, and again, what all of these valves do, whether they're AV valves or semilunar valves do, they make sure blood doesn't backflow. So for example, this valve is going to allow blood to be pumped from the right atrium into the right ventricle, but when the right ventricle pumps, the blood cannot go through the AV valve back into the atrium. Instead, it has to go through the semilunar valve to the artery. The heart can itself use up to 20% of the body's oxygen when it's beating quickly, and oxygenated blood is carried away from the heart through the aorta, which is the largest artery of the body. That aorta then branches out into all of the other arteries, and one of those arteries is the coronary arteries. So the coronary arteries are the arteries that supply oxygen to the muscles of the heart. So they essentially wrap around the outside of the heart. Unlike a lot of other organs, which would slow down if they weren't getting enough oxygen, the heart just continues to beat normally, which is why if you have a blocked coronary artery and that part of the heart isn't getting enough oxygen, it causes like intense chest pain and can lead to a heart attack. Symptoms of coronary blockages include really rapid breathing, chest pain, inability to be physically active, but all of those can be symptoms of other issues as well. So in order to diagnose coronary blockages, something called cardiac catheterization is used. Essentially, a catheter, which is a small, thin, hollow tube, is inserted into an artery in the groin and then pushed all the way up from your groin into the aorta. And then a dye is injected into that tube, that catheter. And as the dye flows through the heart and through all the different blood vessels of the heart, you can actually track the pathway of the dye on a screen. And anywhere where that flow of dye is blocked off, you can then see that there's a coronary blockage there. In order to treat that coronary blockage, you can insert a little balloon into that catheter, and you put it right out the other end of the catheter. You then inflate the balloon to try and open up that blocked artery. That's called an angioplasty. Sometimes you can also use medications to try and break down the clot that has formed in there. However, if the blockage is too severe and neither of those previously mentioned methods work, then a more invasive surgery is required. You might have like a coronary bypass where they take a vein from a different part of the body and essentially like graft it onto the heart to bypass that blocked artery, and the blood will just like kind of detour through that little grafted on vein instead of where it can't go through the artery anymore. That surgery does require the heart to be temporarily stopped because you can't graft the vein onto something that's beating, it's moving too much. So at that point, essentially a machine takes over the role of the heart in pumping oxygenated blood around the body while the surgery is being done. Okay, the heart is made up of cardiac muscle instead of skeletal muscle. And unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle actually has the ability to contract without being stimulated by external nerves. So if we want to move our skeletal muscle, either like some sort of interneuron from our spinal cord has to send that signal to the motor neurons, which then send the signal to your muscle cells. But with skeletal muscle, that heart can continue beating even if it's completely cut off from the central nervous system and there are no interneurons involved. That is why you can actually like remove someone's heart and it will like keep beating for a few minutes, not indefinitely. Muscle with this ability is called myogenic muscle. And heart rate refers to just how quickly the heart is beating. The sinoatrial node, also called the SA node, is what sets the heart rate. It is called the pacemaker of the heart. If there's an issue with this, then a person might need like an artificial pacemaker inserted, but that is like the pacemaker that we all have. The SA node is just a bundle of specialized nerves and muscles. It's located in the upper right atrium. And so the SA node generates a nerve impulse that causes both atria to contract, and that pumps blood from the atria down into the ventricles. And then the nerve impulse is also going to travel to another bundle of specialized cells called the AV node. The AV node, short for atrioventricular node, is located at the bottom of the right atrium. When the impulse gets from the SA node to the AV node passes that impulse onto the bundle of Hoops, which is a bundle of cardiac muscle fibers in the septum, that middle section of the heart. And then that nerve impulse is going to get passed onto the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers then move that impulse to the thick outer muscles of the ventricles. They're called the myocardium. And that causes the ventricles to contract and actually pump the blood out of the heart. So we start right here with the SA node. The SA node sends off an impulse that causes the atria to contract. and then blood is pumped to the ventricles. At the same time, that impulse is also sent to the AV node, which passes the impulse onto the bundle of His, which passes it onto the Purkinje fibers, which then causes the ventricles to contract and pump the blood out of the body. So by the time the blood actually gets pumped from the atria to the ventricles, the impulse has moved between all of these different bundles of nerve fibers, and the ventricles can then contract. The heart rate, like we said, is set by the SA node, but that is influenced by the autonomic nervous system when they're connected like they normally are. The two parts of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight response portion when you're in a stressful situation, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your like rest and digest. You're going back to normal after a stressful situation. So both of these can, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system can move impulses from the brain to the SA node. So the sympathetic nervous system can tell the SA node to increase the heart rate so that blood is flowing to tissues and bringing oxygen to those tissues. And then during times of relaxation, the parasympathetic nervous system tells the SA node to slow down the heart rate. The sound of a heartbeat, which is referred to as the lub-dub, is caused by the closing of the heart valves. So it's actually not like the atria and ventricles contracting that cause the sound of the heartbeat. It is the AV valves snapping shut, and then the semilunar valves snapping shut after the blood has gone through them, and then they close up again. Diastole is when the heart is relaxed. Systole is when the muscle contracts. So during atrial diastole, that is when the blood from the vena cava is coming in and it's filling the atria. It's also when the blood from the pulmonary veins are filling the other atria. So the atria are just relaxed, they're getting filled up with blood, and then with atrial systole, that's when the atria contracts and forces the blood down through the AV valves into the ventricles. During that time, the ventricles are going to be nice and relaxed, so that's the ventricle diastole. And then once the ventricles are filled, they will contract, that's our ventricle systole, and the blood is forced out of the heart through the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Oopsies. Okay, so another diagram of the heart here. So number one, this is the aorta. It goes around behind the heart and comes out down here. So this is also the aorta. Number two is the superior vena cava that brings deoxygenated blood from the upper body into the heart. We have down here at number 8, the inferior vena cava, which brings deoxygenated blood from the bottom of the body up into the heart as well. Both of those bring blood into the right atrium, which is number 5. Number 3 here is the pulmonary artery. Number 2, I think that is over here as well, whatever that number says. That's also pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery comes up and branches like this to go to the 2 separate lungs. Number 4 is the pulmonary veins. Number 10 is also pulmonary veins. So they are both bringing oxygenated blood from the lungs back into the heart, specifically into number 11 over here, the left atrium. So yeah, number 5 is the right atrium. Number 6 is the tricuspid valve. It separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Number 7 is the right ventricle. Then, oh, that must be number 9, it's the pulmonary artery. That one we already talked about. Number 12 is our bicuspid valve. It separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. Number 14 is the left ventricle. Number 13 is the semilunar valves right here. These are also semilunar valves. They separate the ventricle, in this case, the ventricle from the aorta. And this one separates the ventricle from the pulmonary arteries. And then, like I said, this is the aorta down here as well. So to kind of describe the pathway of all of this, so blue is deoxygenated, pink is oxygenated. We have deoxygenated blood coming from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava, both into the right atrium. The right atrium is going to pump that blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood through the semilunar valves out of the pulmonary artery, where it then goes to the lungs. It's going to become oxygenated at the lungs, and then it comes back through the pulmonary veins on both sides into the left atrium. The left atrium pumps the blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps that blood through the semilunar valve out the aorta, which then splits off into different arteries. This is also the aorta down here. It goes around the back of the heart to reach the lower body. Okay, that's it for the heart. Please let me know if you have any questions.